Growth isn't the problem, infrastructure is. For much of the past decade, growth planning assumed that infrastructure constraints were solvable with time and capital. Transmission would be built, water systems would adjust, regulatory processes would catch up. Those assumptions are now colliding with physical and legal limits that are proving harder and slower to move than expected. Across both blue and red states, many growth projects are no longer constrained by demand or financing. They are constrained by whether power, water, and system capacity are legally and physically available when projects come online. Grid limits are becoming growth limits. Electricity access is emerging as one of the most immediate barriers. Load growth from data centers, electrified industry, and population expansion is outpacing transmission upgrades in multiple regions. Analysis from the International Energy Agency, IEA, shows that grid expansion is now lagging electricity demand growth across multiple regions, turning transmission availability into a binding constraint on industrial and digital expansion. In Texas, a market long viewed as structurally pro-growth, grid operators under ERCOT have warned that transmission congestion and regional bottlenecks are complicating large new interconnections. While generation investment remains strong, the sequencing problem is increasingly clear. New load is arriving faster than infrastructure can reliably support it. This has practical consequences. Industrial projects and large energy users are being forced to phase expansion, self-supply, or delay operations, not because markets are unfavorable, but because delivery timelines are uncertain. Water law is quietly reshaping expansion. Water availability is creating equally binding constraints, particularly where legal frameworks have shifted faster than infrastructure solutions. Enforcement by the California State Water Resources Control Board under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is translating long-term hydrological limits into immediate legal constraints for new development. Groundwater basins across California are now subject to mandatory sustainability plans, limiting withdrawals and forcing difficult trade-offs among agriculture, industry, and municipal use. For manufacturers, logistics operators, and developers, this means water access is no longer assumed. Even where capital and permits are in place, projects must now demonstrate long-term water viability, often adding cost, delay, or outright infeasibility to expansion plans. The constraint is not ideological. It is legal and hydrological. System limits extend beyond energy and water. These pressures are not isolated. Grid congestion can amplify water stress as electrification increases demand for cooling and processing. Permitting timelines stretch as agencies contend with overlapping mandates. Transportation and logistics systems struggle to absorb new volume without corresponding upgrades. This is creating a new category of exposure, strategies that cannot be executed as approved. Red and blue states, same constraint. What makes this moment distinct is that infrastructure limits are surfacing across political contexts. Texas's grid challenges and California's water restrictions arise from different policy philosophies, but they produce the same outcome: growth that must be slowed, reshaped, or relocated. The lesson for executives is not about regulation versus deregulation. It is about recognizing that infrastructure capacity, once assumed to be elastic, is now binding. How companies are adjusting? Some organizations are beginning to adapt by treating infrastructure feasibility as a first-order planning variable rather than a downstream execution issue. Across sectors, companies are increasingly emphasizing scenario-based planning that stress tests growth pathways against grid capacity, reliability, and energy availability before commitments are finalized. Others are restructuring expansion plans around phased development, on-site generation, or alternative siting to preserve flexibility. These moves are not about reducing ambition. They are about avoiding stranded growth. The strategic reality. The defining constraint on growth in 2026 is not market demand, labor, or capital. It is whether the systems required to support expansion, power, water, and enabling infrastructure, are legally and physically available in time. Filings from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission have flagged interconnection backlogs as a growing system risk, with queue timelines extending into years rather than months. Growth is still possible, but it is no longer automatic. Organizations that continue to treat infrastructure as a secondary consideration risk discovering that their growth strategies were viable only on paper. Those that acknowledge system limits early and plan accordingly will retain the flexibility others lose. In today's environment, growth isn't the problem, infrastructure is. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.